In this video, I'm going to teach you 10 of the most common and therefore useful phrasal verbs for the C1 Advanced and C2 Proficiency Cambridge English exams. Now, of course, these phrasal verbs are useful for other exams and for general life, but as you know, I specialize in the Cambridge English exams on this channel, so that's what we're looking at here. And you may have noticed that I said 10 of the most common phrasal verbs for these exams, not the 10 most common, because there are new exams being written pretty much every week now, so it may be a changing situation. But I chose these 10 phrasal verbs based on my over 20 years experience. You may also have noticed that I didn't say the 10 most advanced phrasal verbs. And also that's deliberate because they're not the most advanced phrasal verbs. Generally, they're pretty advanced. And you may be thinking, well, why aren't they all advanced? Or why aren't they extremely advanced if they're for the C2 Proficiency Cambridge English exam? Well, in these exams, the vocabulary that is tested is not always the most advanced. It's about how it's used in context and with other words. So how, for example, prepositions are used in phrasal verbs, or how phrasal verbs are used in collocations or in fixed expressions or in idioms. So that's a common misconception. You may find words being tested in the C2 proficiency exam that aren't C2 level words. It's not the same. It depends on the context. Having said that, if you do want to learn some really advanced phrasal verbs to take your English to the next level, I recently launched my advanced phrasal verbs for C1 and C2 level English. The link is in the description, and at the time of making this video, the special launch price is still available. So click on the link and learn some really useful phrasal verbs. But as I said, the phrasal verbs I'm teaching in this video are also useful, but not necessarily the most advanced. It depends how they're used in context. And the first phrasal verb is bring about. Bring about. And this basically means simply cause. But if it was so simple, why don't we just use cause? Well, as with most phrasal verbs, bring about is a little bit more specific than simply cause, because it's used with change. It's really, we use it when we're talking about causing change. So that's the collocation. We often say to bring about change. So the example, the law, which was introduced last year, brought about many changes. Okay, so this law caused many changes, but as I said, we often use bring about specifically with changes. That's the collocation. And the next phrasal verb is go through. Go through, again, go through simply means to experience something, but it's usually something negative. So for example, difficulties, that's a common collocation, to go through difficulties. So again, the example, after university, Sarah went through a tough time before she found a job. So in this case, we haven't used the word difficulties in particular specifically, but we've used a synonym. Tough is difficult, it's another word for difficult. So tough times, difficult times. So Sarah experienced, she went through these tough times before she found a job. And the next phrasal verb is take on, which means to accept responsibility. And again, quite specifically, work. Usually when we use take on, we're referring to work or in work contexts. So the example, Charles realized he had taken on too much when he had to work on Sunday morning. So in this case, Charles realized he had taken on too much work. I mean, it's not always work. He could have taken on responsibilities, for example, helping to coach the local football team. But it's kind of a type of work, right? It's something that he probably doesn't want to do. It's not, you don't take on a hobby, for example. That's something you want to do. You take on something that feels like work. So in this case, Charles realized he had taken too much on when he had to work on Sunday morning, so he couldn't finish his work during the normal working hours. And the next phrasal verb is a very useful one, and you could use it in your reports and proposals, for example, for your exam, and it's rule out. And this means to eliminate or discard, but again, specifically a possibility, for example, or an option. So the example, they couldn't rule out the possibility of human error. This is in the negative, they couldn't. So they couldn't eliminate or discard the possibility of human error. So they couldn't rule out. A really useful one, that one. And the next one is to come across. Now this one I actually do teach in my advanced phrasal verb course. Although it's not a particularly advanced phrasal verb, I use it at the beginning of the course to really explain how some phrasal verbs have various meanings and how some phrasal verbs have the same meaning as other phrasal verbs. So it can get very confusing and complicated when learning phrasal verbs. That's why you need to learn context. That's so important. But the meaning we're looking at for come across in this video is to give a certain impression. So this is quite difficult to understand without an example, but you have to remember that we're talking about a person giving a certain impression, but it may not be the reality. Okay, I think the example will help you with this one. Caroline tried not to come across as pushy in her sales pitch. So Caroline tried not to come across, so she tried not to give the impression of being pushy in her sales pitch. So she's trying to sell something, but she doesn't want to give the impression that she's being aggressive or trying to force the potential customer to buy whatever she's trying to sell. And you may have noticed here that this phrasal verb is followed by as. So you can come across as ignorant, or you can come across as unfriendly, or come across as shy. So these are all things that the impression you may give, but they may not be the reality. Okay, the next phrasal verb. Turn down. Turn down. And this very simply, again, just means to reject something, but specifically an offer or a proposal. And the example, Mike had to turn down the job offer as he was unwilling to relocate. So Mike rejected this offer of work because he was unwilling to relocate. He didn't want to move to another part of the country, so he rejected the offer. He turned it down. You could also turn down a proposal, for example, a proposal of marriage. If someone asks you to marry them, you could turn them down, so you're rejecting them. Okay, the next one you may be familiar with, but it's very useful for the exams because it comes up quite a lot. And when I say that these phrasal verbs come up quite a lot in the exams, often it's in the use of English paper, so in the keyword transformation, part 4, where you have to rewrite the sentence. Also in part 1 of the reading and use of English, maybe in part 2, but also just in the reading texts and the listenings, you could hear these phrasal verbs or read them in the texts. But apart from that, if you can use these phrasal verbs in your writing and your speaking, then the examiners are really going to be impressed and you'll get more marks. But this next phrasal verb is to get away with, And again, this simply means to escape punishment. So it's when you do something bad, but you don't get caught or you don't get punished, even if you do get caught. Okay, the example. The exam invigilator made sure no one got away with cheating. Okay, so cheating is bad, of course. So the invigilator's job is to check and make sure that no one gets away with, so escapes punishment for cheating. Okay, the next phrasal verb. Put up with. Put up with. Another really useful one that you should learn if you don't already know it. For the exams and just for your English in general. It can be used in many contexts. So it means to tolerate. Again, quite simply, to tolerate. The example. The teacher refused to put up with the students' repeated unpunctuality. The teacher refused to put up with the students' repeated unpunctuality. So he refused to tolerate it. So you might think, again, if we have such a good, perfect verb like tolerate, why do we need to learn put up with? Well, it's because it's much more common in English and it sounds much more natural and informal. We don't speak in general in English in a formal way. We don't use these more traditional verbs like to tolerate in normal conversation. We use put up with much more often. And if you want to reach that C1 or C2 level of English, you need to be using more phrasal verbs and more advanced phrasal verbs if possible. Okay, the next one, come up with. Now, come up with means to think of or even to invent. Okay, again, the example. In the meeting, Olga came up with an ingenious solution to the problem. So in the meeting, Olga thought of or invented an ingenious solution to the problem. So she came up with this solution. And the last phrasal verb for this video is to carry out. Again, maybe you're familiar with this phrasal verb, but do you know exactly how to use it? Well, the meaning is simply really to do. It just means do, but more specifically perform. And in the context of an experiment or a task or a study. So this is a relatively formal phrasal verb that you can use in more formal situations like essays or reports or proposals. So the example, a study was carried out to evaluate the impact of remote working. So a study was done, really, you could just say this, a study was done, but that's not very common to hear. I mean, if you said that, people would understand you perfectly and it would be considered grammatically correct, but perhaps not quite natural, because it's much more common to use carry out. You know, English is very precise, and phrasal verbs are particularly precise to give a very specific meaning. Okay, so those are the 10 phrasal verbs that will be very useful for your exam. But again, if you want to go to the next level, then check out my advanced phrasal verb course. The link is in the description, and I'll see you very soon for another video.